representative of the cross-party think tank Demos, and it is really lovely to have you all here today. Today we are here to talk as part of the Collaborative Democracy Network, and this is a network of our friends and colleagues across the sector who care about improving the way democracy works now. We're not going to talk about kind of the crisis of democracy that we're seeing play out directly. Actually, we're going to talk about something that goes a bit deeper, which is about how you deliver public services in a way that instills trust and stronger relationships between state and citizen. The Collaborative Democracy Network is run by my colleague Miriam Levin. Do talk to her before. It's supported by Impact on Urban Health and Carnegie UK. And one of the brilliant things about it is that it convenes audiences like this. So just from looking at the sign-ups, we have 7 government departments, 11 local authorities, 3 combined authorities, 6 think tanks, and multiple civil society organisations, private sector providers, and philanthropic funders, just to give you a sense of who's in the room. And that's why we have drinks, so that you can stay afterwards and meet each other. One of the things we really want to do is build the relationships between our network as well and help the brilliant conversations that come out of these events. So today we are going to be talking about public service reform that meets the needs of people at a point where public services are really struggling, what that public service reform can look like, and also how the centre needs to change to accommodate it. Our format is we've got 4 brilliant speakers who are going to do 3 minutes lightning talks, which just means not 7 minutes, it means 3 minutes, and setting out the stall of where they're coming from a government, community, local government and national kind of perspective. And then I'm keen to kind of ask a few of my own questions, but open it out quickly to the audience, because I'm very conscious of the level of expertise we have in the room and keen to include as many voices as possible. So we have Nick Kimber, Director of Public Service Reform in the Cabinet Office, where he leads the Test, Learn and Grow programme, the voice of government. Martin Johnston, who is co-director of the Poverty Truth Network, which brings together senior civic and business leaders to work alongside those most directly impacted by poverty to enable change, the kind of voice of community and the bottom-up element of this. We have Sam Harris, who is head of strategic safeguarding and independent review at Nottinghamshire County Council, with a really rich experience of this kind of people-powered innovation. And then my brilliant colleague Anna Gared, who leads Demos's policy, external engagement and communications work, and is currently relaunching and shaping our public service reform programme to concentrate on that question of what the centre can do differently. So we are going to pass around these mics between us. When we get to questions, there'll be mics as well. It's for the audience at home. This is all live on YouTube. But you have to shout to be heard in the room as well. So, Nick, I'm going to pass to you to start.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. Voice of government, maybe not. I am a local government officer through and through, so I spent my entire career working in communities, neighbourhoods, but I've come into government to deliver something called Test, Learn and Grow, and I think to some extent to be a bridge between different worlds and bring in some of the kind of language concepts and practice of relational public services and relational public management, and figure out ways in which the centre can facilitate the sort of brave and bold public work that happens across the country every day, but sometimes is constrained by things that can only really be changed at the centre. Like my theme, I guess, in the 2 minutes I have left is about movement. So some of the advice that I was given by a senior ex-civil servant when I came into government was you can make change through legislation, through money, and through a ministerial megaphone. was good advice. Wise person gave it to me, but it sat slightly uneasily with me. I was like, well, that is not the way that I've made change in my career to this point. And I think there is something about movement and bottom-up approaches to change, which include civil servants, activist civil servants who want to make change and feel as constrained as anyone else, coming together and thinking about how they do that. So my focus in my work is on momentum, movement. Movements require things like this, so coming together. They require an architecture and an infrastructure. So it's an easy word to say. It's a hard thing to build. But I think that is a lever that we haven't pulled. And there is massive untapped potential. So that's how I think we make some of the progress that Polly described us needing to make.
Thank you, Nick. Martin?
Hi. Thank you. Let me just try and give a very simple answer to a really complicated question. And so how do we deliver a new deal for people first public services? I think probably the experience of the Poverty Truth Network would be to say it's by putting people first. And what Poverty Truth Commissions do, and we've had about 35 of them across the UK over the last 10 years or so, is they bring together two groups of people. They bring together people who have that direct, ongoing experience of a struggle against poverty, and senior civic business leaders who want to bring about change. But critically, the first people who are in the room are those who have that direct experience of poverty. And they may actually be in the room for as long as 6 months, getting to know one another and one another's struggles, before then the other people are invited into the room. And by virtue of doing that, we found all sorts of things have been able to change. We found gypsy traveller sites able to be taken into different ownership. We found the ability to kind of change the ways that debt letters are written by local government officers. We found ways of changing legislation around kinship care or practice around school grants. And so if I was to sum up all of this in 3 words, it would just be the one word. It would be relationships, relationships, relationships. And then as part of the work over the last 2-3 years that we've been involved with has been with one of the sponsors tonight, with Carnegie UK Trust. And over the summer, we ran 3 residentials looking at what a new social contract looked like. And we came up with lots of really interesting things, but almost the key thing that I think we were discovering in that process was too often when we were trying to think about those new people first public services, we were thinking simply about the relationship between the state and the individual citizen. And we were missing out of the equation far too often the communities that people came from, whether they were communities of interest or physical geographical areas. And actually we'll not, we think, be able to build that new social contract unless we have citizens, the state, and communities.
Wonderful, thank you. Sam?
Oh, thank you. So in children's social care, people first public service isn't an abstract idea. So I see every day the impact when families encounter a system that responds to them as human beings, and the harm when the same system fails to do that. A current example that springs to mind is 2 children who urgently need to move to their father's care. Everybody involved agrees, but the housing situation prevents that from being able to happen. Or a young person in need of mental health support, unable to access school, which means mum's unable to go to work. but the waiting list is too long. And these aren't isolated stories, they're symptoms of systems that don't join up around people's lives, often despite the very best intentions and efforts of professionals. In Nottinghamshire, we've been using a test, learn and grow approach. It's really early, and there's much work to do to embed this way of working. But we have positive and compelling evidence that putting user voices at the centre of radically transparent conversations can allow us to find new partnership ways of working. I think that's about relationships, really, isn't it? And it's not easy, but I've seen how it builds trust, momentum and confidence. So to me, a new deal for people first public services means three things. It means being brave in prioritising prevention over crisis. That's so easy to say, but so hard to do. Collaboration over silo and trust over bureaucracy. And a new deal will mean that families won't have to fight their way through a fractured system. Their experience will be of a human system designed around them and therefore worthy of their trust. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the evening's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. So here at Demos, we're talking about powering public service reform and thinking about collaborative democracy as we are the Collaborative Democracy Network, how these two things link together. And for us, elections happen every 5 years, but it's actually every single day that we interact with the state. And it's in our kind of day-to-day trying to get a GP appointment, trying to get the SEND support for your child, trying to battle the admin to access certain benefits. It's in those day-to-day interactions that our relationship with the state and the communities around us is formed. And at the moment there is grit in those interactions that's eroding trust on a daily basis. So for us, powering public services reform isn't just about efficiencies, it's not just about improving outcomes, which certainly needs to happen, but it's actually about seizing the moment to show that government is there for people and communities. And the Australians talk about a fair go, the idea that if you kind of do your bit, government will be there as a safety net to support you. And we've lost that concept here. People feel scared, they feel in crisis. And that's fueling a lot of the polarised debate we're seeing at the moment around scarcity of resources, cost of living, and that feeling that you need to protect your patch. And we perhaps saw that most alarmingly at the weekend. So thinking about then what the centre needs to do differently, and this is where I've been working with a brilliant colleague, Demos fellow Amy Gandon, on thinking about Whitehall as a starting point for these conversations. And Amy spent the summer talking to civil servants, past and present, local government reformers, people in civil society, to explore the barriers in day-to-day working that stop the brilliant examples of reform that we've heard becoming the reality, because we know they exist. The energy at the edges is there. We just know that relational reform isn't the norm, it's the exception at the moment. I just wanted to highlight two themes that have come out of this work, and the paper's going to be published really shortly, so we will be sharing it far and wide and encourage you to do the same. So thinking about Whitehall itself, and this might be a bit confronting for those of you who are, as Nick is, the voice of government. But two phenomenon came out in the conversations Amy was having over the summer that really struck me. One is that the kind of behaviour we're rewarding in government is that of what Amy's called policy heroes. So people who are slick, competent, inspire trust and reassure, and actually all those behaviours perhaps lean to risk aversion, knowing what you know and sticking with that rather than experimenting and being willing to collaborate and admit failure. So actually, how do we encourage a different way of working in Whitehall? How do we move away from the hero, the policy hero who can swoop in and reassure the minister that everything's okay? And then the second phenomenon is just that risk aversion that's already been alluded to, that when failure amounts to scandal, the system can't learn. And yet when we talk about innovation, when we talk about creativity, we are actually talking about failing a bit. And so how can we shift the system to become less risk averse? And that involves looking at hierarchy, it looks at accountability systems, but also, you know, we were talking about the importance of language. So how do we fail quick, fail small, fail cheaply, and then treat those moments as learning? With that, I'll finish.
Thank you all very much. I feel like there's kind of lots of different directions we could go with this conversation. But just to take a step back for a minute, I remember about 2.5 years ago in this room, Georgia Gould came to do an event on relational public services with us. So I just wanted to kind of contrast where we were 2.5 years ago to where we are this week on this whole agenda that has been kind of laid out here. With Nick now kind of leading Test, Learn and Grow with these principles in mind. But even in the last week, there has been huge change. And I know when Nick arrived, the first thing I said to him, what does all the change in government mean for your agenda, for this agenda? And I can see heads nodding. So I'm just going to start there. I think we have to kind of flush that out a bit. So Nick, is Test, Learn and Grow still part of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, odd as it might sound, the work is more resilient than it was a couple of weeks ago. So I worked with Georgia very closely in a Camden context and in a government context. So she wrote the first chapter of the work, you know, her in combination with Pat McFadden. Starting's always the hardest thing to do, I think. But actually the fact that both she and Pat have gone now to major public service departments in DWP and in DFE means that the kind of message, ethos, instincts are being kind of carried, and that is both Test and Learn as a program, practice and approach, but it's also a sort of broader framing around relational approaches and the importance of place. So I tell my team, and I've told the sort of local government community over the last week or so, that actually this has been a good thing. I think the process of kind of building relationships with the new ministers in Cabinet Office from a personal perspective couldn't have gone better. So we've got a great cadre of kind of new ministers who have been well briefed by Georgia, I think. Asking all of the right questions and have the same like passions and instincts, I think. So I think it's positive. I think the work needs to travel, like it needs to be resilient beyond individuals and actually beyond political cycles and different flavours of administration. And that's not actually something government can do. I think there's an ecology of this work which is much richer than Whitehall and Whitehall departments, and it's people like us in this room, which is why my remarks centred on movement and how you build them, because those are the things that make generational change, I think, not really governments.
And with that in mind, what my kind of question to everyone on the panel is about the grow bit. Kind of what are the blockers and opportunity to growing this relational way of working that we know is happening already in lots of ways across the country? Test, Learn and Grow is kind of encouraging it. But what are the kind of blockers and potential solutions for the grow bit? I'm going to start.
So I think I would kind of feel there are maybe two blockers. One is actually about fear, and fear and vulnerability that run together. That actually your sense of people who are desperate to do a really, really good job, to actually go into spaces acknowledging that despite the fact that they're trying to do a really good job, they're not having really good outcomes, I think is really, really difficult for people. And how you help people to have the courage to say, actually, there's an awful lot of stuff that, despite our best efforts, we're not getting right. So I think that fear bit is one, and in actual fact, I do think, and this may feel really ironic in the environment that we're in, it does seem to me that kind of one of the other huge challenges we've got is that we continue to be focused on the ideas of scarcity rather than abundance. And in actual fact, there is a huge amount of really astonishing stuff happens in our communities, happens in those most vulnerable of families all the time. But we run the risk of only ever seeing people as a problem to be solved, rather than actually working out how we can really enable them to flourish and to thrive in the way that they may actually have done for much of their life. And so, you know, I think it would be that fear and scarcity for me would be two of the things.
I couldn't echo that more. But I think also there's something about language. So about a blocker is when we think about outputs versus outcomes and the ability to think long term. So I think in local government, we've been used to, for a really long time, having sort of siloed pots of money with quite short turnaround times for evidencing the outcomes against that spend. And it's really difficult to do that shift to thinking long term and thinking about how we would see outcomes longer term from some really brave decisions that might not show us much change at all in the next year. And I think, to me, that's a key blocker, and I think that's locally, but also sort of in the centre in terms of a particular area for me is something called the Families First programme, sort of very children centred, but there's a sort of impetus to take a test learn and grow approach there, but no accountability built into that programme for doing so. So therefore, if you're not inclined to work in that way, there isn't a sort of push for you to necessarily do so. And I think there's a sort of lack of joined up messaging from government departments around that as well. So really good start, but work to do that in terms of the blockers. I think in terms of the enablers, again, both in the centre and locally, it's something about really visible leadership that's willing to come into the spaces where the work is happening, rather than receiving assurance about the work in corporate offices. And again, that's a shift. You know, if you look at any leader's diary, it's going to be absolutely stuffed. Since we moved to hybrid working, you go Teams meeting. It's tricky to shift into being in those spaces rather than being in meetings. But I think to sort of finish there, it's about thinking about this as a way of working that shifts culture rather than a sort of new shiny thing, and that it's a way of framing feeling safe to fail fast and to feel safely, and welcoming the learning this provides. And I think that observation at the beginning about learning equals failure equals scandal does make learning really tricky. If you feel like you get it wrong and you're going to be heavily criticised, or it's going to be in the media, it's very difficult to feel safe taking that risk. So
So we can send that one.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I'm going to focus on what I think are blockers and enablers. So working in place, the value you get from those local relationships and from the expertise of the community and the professionals in that place produces these brilliantly innovative but tailored services that work. And in my previous role, I was in a place-based funder, and we drove forward some really innovative, fabulous, community-based holistic services, working entirely in partnership with tiny community organisations right up to the local authorities. And the challenge came when people said, "Oh, that's great. Let's lift and shift. Let's just replicate that elsewhere." And actually, it was so reliant on the relationships between local housing associations, the local authorities, the GP surgeries, when we were arranging for debt payment holidays for people in health crises, for example. That was highly, highly relational. So you cannot just copy it. So what are the learnings about that particular circumstance? And there are certainly some circumstances you don't want to replicate that are really, really conducive to doing this sort of reform. And Nick Timmins, years ago, did some work for the King's Fund around Christchurch and the massive earthquake that happened there. That health and social care system had been trying to reform for decades and not succeeding. The earthquake happened and literally they had to start from scratch. And there was an enormous influx of funding, and suddenly everybody was on the same page. Nobody was territorial over what they had because the services didn't exist anymore. And brilliantly integrated services emerged out of that crisis. So thinking about what it takes to get people to go back to those kind of first principles, you know, what would we be doing if we didn't have anything to start with or feel protective of in the first place? But that is also a huge challenge.
Nick, can I come back to the movement point? Because I think what we've just heard there are some kind of quite hard blockers about the way money flows and about how accountability works, and then the kind of soft kind of cultural side of people feeling exposed and taking risks. Like the kind of focus that you have on movement building, how does it address some of those kind of challenges?
I think it gives like agency to people who want to change. So I think some of the things that we understand to be blockers are like relatively well rehearsed. Like I think most people would say that the way we understand and account for cost is siloed and doesn't make any sense from a human perspective or from a sort of global financial perspective. It makes sense through a departmental system of accountability, but in no other way does it make sense. And you'd get to a list that most people in this room with time would agree with, but sometimes the climb up to the summit seems so enormous, and people have had a go at it so many times before, no one quite knows how to start or who's accountable for it. I think there are probably ways that people can have a go at it beginning next week in small ways. So if you're a grade 7 working in Treasury who accepts the proposition that the way we do business cases is fundamentally broken, you do have quite a lot of power because no one's watching you every step of the way in every conversation. You can do stuff differently. And no one needs to give you that type of permission because you're grown up and you're well paid and you're smart and you just need to have a go. So I think there is something about encouraging agency and license and then connecting those people who want to act in that way, because there's lots of them about. I mean, I've met nothing but brilliant people in the civil service, but there aren't necessarily the sort of platforms and safe spaces for people to come and the sort of legitimizing language that means that it's okay to do that. But I think we can create a culture where that is okay. That is what we mean by taking risks, I think. They can be proportionate, sensible, but we're not taking enough of them. But you can't just expect people magically to come to work and be more innovative and take more risks. Like, you need to do something to facilitate that.
Martin, the word relational is, we were talking before, that it's the word that sums up this practice to me, and the kind of the living of it on the ground, and it's what makes it feel different when you encounter a relational service. But I have also seen political and civil services eyes roll into the back of their head the minute you say the word relational. So I wondered, and I might open this one out to the audience as well, kind of thinking about the kind of language that will rally people behind a movement, bring people together and create that legitimacy that makes it feel innovative and empowering and all of those things, but not too woo-woo. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'd be fascinated in what other language people might use about that. But in some ways, I'm going to stick with relational, but kind of try and say a little bit about how we try and make that work, if that's okay. And that would be that a commission runs for 18 months, 2 years. It quite deliberately brings together a group of 15 people with direct experience of poverty and 15 senior leaders. And it forces them into a room month after month after month until they genuinely start listening to one another rather than problematizing one another. And then at the end of that, hopefully for the majority of the people in that room who are civic leaders, they've got enough of that way of working to be going back into their institutions and into their organisations. And then one of the things that we often then do is we run a second commission, which then becomes another group of 15 senior leaders. And actually, when you've run 2, 3, or 4 of those things, then suddenly you've got a cohort of 60, 70 senior leaders in Leeds, all of whom have been Poverty Truth Commissioners. And therefore, actually, they start talking a language to one another which helps them to be brave in making some of the changes. And so I think we really do need to struggle with what are the other things about relationships, but we also kind of need to recognize that it is relationships that actually get us out of bed every morning. And therefore, it's deep within us as human beings.
Sam, in your experience, I imagine you have. I've seen you present the story in such a compelling way. I imagine you've also met your fair share of skeptics along the way. How have you kind of told the story and brought people with you and tackled that?
I think that there's a simpler way of talking about relational, which is doing with rather than doing to. And I think if you start to tell stories about how you've done with, and you contrast that with both the professional and family's perspective and what that feels like compared to what it feels like to do to, it's just incredibly powerful. And when you're working in public service, almost all of us are here, right, because we want to do something better for whichever sort of cohort of people brought us here. So for me, it's children and families, but for others, it could be all different people, couldn't it? Different citizens. But we're all here for that common purpose. And when you start to tell stories that are about doing with, working with, the reason you came here in the first place, but you can't really remember it sometimes because it is so tricky, it's just really powerful. And I think it's as simple as that. That's where the effectiveness has been. Sometimes it's nice to throw in a little data, just to kind of give it that little kick. But most of the time, telling the story about doing something with is the most powerful thing you can do. And I think what we need to think about is how we invest in that as a leadership quality. Being able to tell stories compellingly is really important. And I'm not sure we necessarily invest in that or prioritise that when we're thinking about who we want our leaders to be or our variety of sort of leadership skills.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up to the audience now. So I'm going to invite comments as well as questions, because I know there are lots of people with brilliant experience in the room. I'll start with the gentleman on the right here.
Hi, good evening. Dave Cohen, Haringey Climate Forum. Interested in what you just said there about doing to versus doing with. Shouldn't that really start at the very top? So shouldn't that be the whatever Whitehall and the Treasury, and then the next layer down? There's very much a sense I feel that it's that the doing to starts at the top. And I've started to see examples of local councils, for instance, working very much with our local community. So we're doing it at the ground level, but shouldn't it come from the top?
Nick, do you want to take that? Because I know maybe calling more on your Camden experience, you might relate to some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should come from everywhere, but I think there is absolutely a role for visible leadership of that. So my Camden experience has been of that work being led politically by Georgia, but also by the chief executive. So the level of sort of political and managerial ambition and connection was incredibly high, and very powerful, and moved an organisation along like relatively rapidly. Organisations like that don't move terribly fast, but Georgia and Jenny made, I think, big and important progress on that. And I think you're right, without that example, that kind of active leadership, then again you are requiring a sort of heroism from people deeper down in the system. I think particularly in local government that feels like a hard expectation, because you've got people dealing with the sort of moral injury of seeing citizens in front of them and not being able to give them necessarily the things that they need because there aren't the resources to go around, and that's incredibly difficult. So they need both inspirational leadership, but also like frameworks and things to keep them safe in the work. So I think it needs to come from everywhere, but I think you're right, there is a leadership task. We need to make that a bit easier for some of those leaders, I think both politicals and officers and officials. So they do need to be trained to do it, supported in the way that you've described, which I love that description of the kind of cohort cascading effect, because you're not just born to it. Like it's a skill, a competency that can be acquired if it's taught. We just haven't taught it, and we haven't optimised for those things over the last 20 or so years. Certainly in local government, we've optimised for, can you manage on a really tight margin? Can you make your cuts because we need to deal with austerity? So I think the whole model of public management and leadership is something that we need to kind of look at. We need to train our leaders fundamentally differently.
Thank you so much. Opening up to lots of hands now. If we go 1, 2, 3. You got on.
Thank you. I've got a question about kind of creating systems that enable, I guess, like cross-pollination of expertise. So I think we all know that, getting an outsider's view on a really intractable problem can be really helpful. I always use this example, but one of my best friends is a mental health nurse. She's an absolute expert in the asylum system and the housing crisis, just by dint of who she's working with day to day. And I guess just thinking about how this approach can enable that kind of cross-pollination and possibly in turn give some kind of respite to frontline workers who are at risk of otherwise leaving the profession entirely, and whether there's just, when, I guess at a civil service level, when you've got 101 priorities yourself, how do you incentivise your team to turn to the next department's priority, even though they could be of huge help? Thinking aloud clearly with that question, but...
Brilliant, Cressida. Will you introduce yourself?
Grace Wild from the Future Governance Forum.
Thank you. And we'll take the 3 together. So.
Hello, Patrick King from NEC Corporation. We work closely with central and local governments and with charities and the third sector. Picking up on the theme of doing things with people rather than to people, I'm always surprised, having spent nearly 50 years in this industry, how we see charities and voluntary groups doing the work of actually finding out what's really needed by people by asking them what they need and why they need it. And if you get that right, you can actually achieve all the efficiencies and the savings and so on going forward. And I'm interested particularly in, for example, the justice sector. And I look at people like Lord Timpson and the work he's done in trying to actually reduce reoffending by giving people the opportunity to stop them from offending in the first place. And I think that if people were in power were to actually look at those sorts of examples of how you can actually prevent a lot of these problems in the first place by understanding and discovering what goes on in that area of community, that could help an awful lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. Can I just ask a question back, which is when you said that charities are particularly good at getting information, building the relationship with people. Is it relevant that they are not the state? Do you think it is important that they're not the state?
That is precisely why they do what they do, and they do it well, because they're not constrained by politics or fear. They are only interested in doing good, and good for them means actually making a change for the better for the lives of people that they want to work with and improve.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you. Where was the hand at the back? There we go. Who was first? You have to be honest. There we go. We'll come to you, officer.
Hi, James Maddox from the NHS Confederation. Been quite fortunate in my role to work between the NHS and community organisations on a few projects. And I think my reflection is obviously quite rightly that the focus is on how you change the state and the apparatus of the state to come to communities more. But obviously that is a long change that will take a long process to do well. I suppose my reflection from the work I've done is in the here and now, how can we better support community organisations to adapt their approaches and sort of almost play the game of the state to be successful in the here and now? Because for various valid reasons, I think I've noticed that that's not always the case. There's very valid reasons to be reticent or resourcing reasons not to be able to play the game. But to wait for cultural change is not always possible. So so the work I do, how can I better support those communities to navigate that sort of very real barrier that they face?
Well, brilliant set of questions. Thank you. So Grace's question on the kind of cross-pollination and how do you incentivise a public sector worker who sees the whole picture of that person to stray into other areas. I don't know, do you want to pick that up, Sam? Is that... Go on. Sorry, the mic thing is getting complicated.
Happy not to have a mic, but I'm not sure people on YouTube. But I think the key for me in the particular piece of work where I did this was in the front door to children's services, so the space in which people and members of the community can make a referral to say we're worried about something that's happening to a child, and then the sort of operation that goes on to respond to that. And I think what we found was that our police colleagues, our health colleagues, education colleagues, probation colleagues, local authority colleagues were all really struggling day to day with their frustration about how they weren't able to work together effectively, even though they were in the same room and they had personal friendships, but they couldn't actually give you a shared understanding of the problem. There wasn't a shared language that said, this is actually the problem we're all coming up against. And when somebody, not independent, because I'm not independent, I'm employed by the local authority, but I'm different, I'm not somebody who's operating in that space all the time, went in and just started asking the questions and then reflecting back and saying, oh, okay, so a little bit like you do really, in the Poverty Commission on a much smaller scale. So what's your interpretation of what's going wrong here? Okay, well, that sounds similar to that. How do we get that common language? And then once everybody's in that same place around what the problem is, they get together around how to solve it. So I think a lot of it is about just brokering curious conversations and being given the time to do that and seeing that as a valid exercise.
Can I come in on that, Bonnie? A few years ago, I was a really innovative local authority used a very small amount of funding they had to fund research and policy capacity in a child and adolescent mental health service. And so it's that kind of point about being done to or done with. They said to the service, like, what are you lacking? We've got some funding. Do you want more clinicians? And they said, no, we need some brain space, somebody who can just do the number crunching, do the research. And so I applied and I went into that service for a year, and I took commissions from the clinicians and the psychotherapists. They just said, we want to know about the demand for this service or this issue in this country, and kind of did that for them. And over the course of the year, we redesigned the system so that the waiting list went from over 300 young children and young people to 0. Just because they were able to look at actually the underlying causes of what was going on in their service, and nobody had the time to do it. Unfortunately, it was a year's funding, and within a year it had gone back up to 400. So it's just a really classic example of sometimes it's not just cross-pollination, but there are skills across the system. Where are we putting them? Are we putting them right at the front door, or is Whitehall kind of hoarding all that capacity itself?
Yeah, and this kind of picks up in the conversation that we were having just before we started. Like, one of the things that strikes me with this is that people actually have to tell their story so many times to so many services, and it's such a huge waste of resource. But it's also a deeply, deeply traumatic experience for people. And how are we able to recognise that actually a number of those services, and they may be charity services as well, kind of really do need to hear the person's reality and then work out how their different services might actually support that one person's life, rather than actually pretending, which they often do, that they're supporting 6 or 7 different people, which feels just such a waste of public resource, but also just such a demoralizing thing for the people who are at the center of this.
Absolutely, thank you. I happen to know we've got someone in the audience who can answer the prevention question better than most people. So what I'd like to do is pick up on the civil society points in here. But Caroline, would you mind if we came to you afterwards, just to pick up on it was Patrick's question about kind of the funding point. But Nick, just while you gather your thoughts on that, so I haven't put you on your spot too much. Nick, Patrick and James both raised the question about really kind of partnership between state, civil society, communities, and actually how do you get closer into communities and as far away from your office as possible. What are you learning about that?
I mean, a couple of reflections. So, like James on your what can I do now point, which I think is like a really good one. Like, what can I take away and do next week? One of the things that I think you can provide to organisations working that way, to communities, sometimes is information and access. So there's a civil service colleague of mine who is trying to start up an initiative called Coming Home, which is about senior civil servants developing a relationship with a place that they've got a connection to. So where they grew up, where they first went to university, ideally not where they live now in case of the conflict of interest, but spending a day every 6 weeks in that place, in that community, getting to know it, and then figuring out with a local authority chief exec or someone who runs a VCS organisation in that place, how can I provide value to you? How can I make Whitehall less opaque to you and help you navigate it? And there's a real kind of power to that information and that type of conversation. So I had one with the chief exec of Reigate and Banstead Council. So I grew up in a place called Redhill, which is a fairly nondescript town, a little bit of East Croydon that sort of got lost in East Surrey. But it was really powerful to spend time with someone talking about the community theatre that I knew. I had my first kiss in the foyer, and have her talk about the spreadsheet conversation about whether that survived. And in the mix of local government reorganisation, her fear being that someone would tell her that people can get on the train and go to Dorking in Mole Valley because it's just down the road. Whereas, like, if you know the place, you know that's not an option. No one would ever do that. You're just closing this institution. So there is something about like knowledge, information, but just kind of connection, which I think in the civil service, often that's seen as like quite soft and not really like a thing that you should do. And there's no big price tag attached to it. And there's no big national policy. But that is a way of making quite powerful change, in some ways quite immediate change. And I think in whatever context that people are working, there's a version of that, I think, that is a thing that you can do next week. And that's alongside the bigger conversations about the shift in policy that we need.
And sticking with that theme as well, there's so many people in this room who work in this in one way or the other, and I think are, keen to be and are part of a movement around this. What can people who aren't in those positions do? What do we do differently out of a conversation like this?
Say that again, just briefly.
Well, I just wanted you to say a bit more about what else we can do. Kind of people in this room with the kind of passion for this and.
Oh God, that's actually quite a difficult question. One thing is like carry the conversation into the next conversation that you have, I think. So I'd encourage anyone who's like got something from today to talk with a colleague about it, to think about what is the thing that you can do next week. Like one of the things I often think is like quite a good discipline is if you just like force yourself on the train on the way home to like begin the email about the action that you're going to take forward from the thing that you've just been to. Because there are things like, but they're almost unique to you and the context that you're operating in. So it's quite hard to describe what the practical thing is that an individual can kind of take away from it. But I think certainly being part of like convenings like this, which again I think can be seen as something that's not core to the business, the job that you've got, whatever the job that you have is. But they absolutely are, like the connection and the relationships that you build through it are potentially incredibly powerful.
When you go.
Oh, it's very simple. I think there's a question that is useful, a sort of reframing in lots of different conversations, which is just what would better look like tomorrow? And I've pinched that from lots of other places. It's not mine, but I've found it really effective. Just giving people permission to stop looking for this, what perfect might be or what brilliant might be, just actually being brave enough to say, well, what would a bit better look like? Because a bit better is still better. I've just found that a really useful practical insertion into lots of different spaces that has moved us into a different conversation. So that would be like a practical thing that's worked for me.
And one of the very practical things that we've tried to do with a number of commissions was we set up a mentoring scheme whereby we set it up with the Scottish Government, where a group of senior civil servants, instead of doing that coming home or going home, we actually said, you know, what's the policy area that you have responsibility for? And then let's find you someone with direct experience of that issue. So for a number of years, we had the person in the Scottish Government who led in youth justice reform being mentored on a monthly basis by someone who'd spent part of their life in a young offenders institute, and kind of just having that ongoing conversation. Actually, for most of us, if we think about the area that we're really passionate about and then think, who is the most local or the person who really, really knows that issue from the sharp end, and can I go and have a conversation with them tomorrow that says, actually, can we meet up once a month for the next 6 months so that I can really understand this issue from your place rather than simply from mine, and talk to you about some of the things that I'm really grappling with.
One thing we've been talking about, and we touched on earlier, is that there's a kind of a hint of, without meaning to use an aggressive analogy, like guerrilla warfare to what's going on, where people know they're doing brilliant things, or they know their colleagues are, and there's those kind of underground connections and the kind of tap on the shoulder and sharing of stories and intel. And I think that's so powerful as a kind of movement, organic movement building. Do we need a more unifying story as well on top of that, so people know they're part of that movement? And I think this speaks to civil society as well. We used the phrase earlier, energy at the edges. It is happening. Brilliant innovation is happening. Civil society, the state, local authorities working together with the private sector as well. And so often it's just in those local areas, do we need a unifying story that tells a political message as well, so people know what's happening? But then also thinking about that, who's telling the story? Because we had a really interesting conversation with a government comms person who said they'd done loads of testing around TikTok videos and Blue Sky and X messages from ministers or from frontline professionals, so contrasting a local nurse with a minister, and actually which ones erode trust and which types of content build trust. So who is giving this message as well? Do we need a story? And then who are our storytellers? Because it's probably not the usual suspects as well in this kind of work.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Caroline next. So I feel very inspired by what you just said, but we need to also talk about money, because money really has a huge kind of impact on this. So Caroline, do you want to introduce yourself and just share a little bit of your thoughts about
Yes.
preventative spending?
Well, thank you. Thank you for casting me as an expert here. I mean, I'm partly an expert because I worked in the Treasury and designed the current public expenditure system. So, you know,
I just love it when she name drops that.
I
mean, that's quite
I know,
exciting.
as you do, you know, as a senior civil servant. And so I kind of know its flaws, but I also know that you can change it. And I think a lot of people sort of feel that it's almost immutable. But I was also part of something called the Early Action Task Force, which was led by Community Links, based in Newham. But it brought in a lot of people, including me, and people from think tanks, to think, you know, how can we actually make prevention common practice? Because the system gets in the way. And, you know, I think there's some pretty obvious things, and, you know, Sam mentioned them actually, about, you know, finding that space to think long term and the permission to think long term. And the public expenditure system, we try to make it longer term, but it, you know, it's still, especially, you know, as when resources are scarce, tends to bear down on that first year. And it tends to end in, you know, tends to cut out things like social infrastructure that actually have long-term impacts, because you can't see the effects in the, you know, the short term. You've got to kind of balance the budget. So I think longer-term planning is a really critical part of this, and also thinking in terms of, you know, the impact of spending over a 10-year period rather than just, you know, tomorrow. So, you know, and thinking across silos, so that you I think actually Nick mentioned sort of accounting costs in a proper way. You know, really thinking about the costs right across the piece. So I think all of those are important. But you know, one of the big issues is that people say, well, you know, we can't find the extra money that we need to make things, you know, work. And Martin, you mentioned abundance, and actually there's a lot of abundance in the system. I mean, the Treasury, you know, I'm not a Treasury official anymore, but I still think a bit like one from time to time. You know, you always say, well, we're spending a lot of money, we just need to spend it differently. But it's not just about spending public money. It's about really recognising that there are massive resources in society, in civil society, but also inside the public sector, that if they were used better, could free up those resources. And I'm co-founded the Better Way Network, and we talked a lot within the network about prevention. And one of the things which people said, which I thought was really important, is it's not just about moving from you know, acute to preventative services, which can be a massive shift. It's also about getting it right first time. If you get it right first time in a service, actually you start to save money, which can be used in a preventative way. And it's, you know, it's a day-to-day thing. It's not sort of, you know, pie in the sky tomorrow. This is, you know, you're delivering your service, and there is so much waste in that service that a lot of our public services are predicated on what some specialists call failure demand. You know, it's just revolving doors going round and round and round. So I think that that's part of it. And I think also ring fencing preventative expenditure, because it tends to be the first thing that's cut back in a crisis, and we constantly seem to be in a crisis. I mean, lots more that I could say, but I think can we start to think about resources differently? It's not just the public sector's resources, it's the resources of the people in our communities, and it's the resources of civil society. We are a rich country.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to wrap up there, but mostly so everyone can help themselves to a drink and continue the conversation. We're really keen that we build a network here that is not just about what we learn from you, but about what you learn from each other. And Caroline, I really appreciate that kind of expertise that comes in the door at Demos, and we're really lucky to have you all here. So thank you. I want to say a huge thank you to our speakers. I think there's a kind of like the bit that I'm really interested in from everything that was interesting of this conversation is the kind of interplay between policy and hard levers like money and accountability, and then the cultural side and the movement building and the storytelling and the kind of influencer strategy you need to sustain these beyond the lifetime of a parliament or a government, and to make this a norm rather than a reform. And the work that Anna and Amy are doing for Demos is really thinking about those things. Do talk to them about it. And I hope you'll all be back for the next of these events in a couple of months' time. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you hugely to our panellists as well for a really rich conversation. Thank you. Sorry,